but I hope that is useful in terms of the way a balance sheet works. Now we're going to look at a bank balance sheet. It's going to be really interesting because it's a very, very different kind of look. But the book value is what shareholders' equity is. In other words, it's kind of what is the company worth at bottom. And if you're a real deep value investor, you kind of look at book value as like, this is the worst case scenario if the company were to shut down today. Now that's not always true, but it's again, some of this gets very involved in detail. Let's make a model for JP Morgan, and I'll save this on my GitHub. And if you go to my GitHub, you can look at all my models. They're mostly in pharma and biotech and tech, but I'll do this one for JP Morgan just for the special occasion. So the first thing I look at is the stock price, and we have $133.65, and then I want to look at the shares outstanding. So I'm going to go to the SEC website, sec.gov, and I just type in JP Morgan stock ticker JPM. And I could also use a different information service provider like Bloomberg or my system, which is called Godel, and I can use these service providers to quickly pull up company filings. So if you use one of these systems, you can rapidly pull up a 10K or 10Q without having to go to a website. But these are sometimes expensive or difficult to use systems. So in any event, this is my system called Godel, which I'll be unveiling publicly soon. We have beta users at the moment, and it's a free system, so it's definitely something that I'm looking forward to showing all you guys. And you can definitely use it at your convenience for free when it's out. So in any event, let's go to their SEC filings on the SEC's website, which is accessible for free to everyone. And what we're looking for is the Form 10K. There's a lot of these weird other forms, because this, I guess, when you're a bank company, and you're the biggest bank company, you have tons of different bizarre SEC filings. So I'm just going to type in 10K and see what happens there, or click here. So here's their JP Morgan's 10K. And this is the most important document that you could read as a business person for any business, is the so-called 10K. And in fact, if you know what Warren Buffett does every day, it's mostly reading 10Ks. So I developed Godel with some programmers, so I have a software company now. So anyway, JP Morgan's 10K is very important to read, because if you think about what the biggest businesses in the world are, JP Morgan's one of them. So if you want to be somebody who's interested in the stock market or cares, reading this once a year is not too much trouble to sort of undertake. Now, the most important thing about 10Ks to me is that right on their first page, you can see how many shares outstanding the company has. And that might be hard to see, but it says 2.9 billion number of shares of common stock outstanding as of January 31st, 2023, 2.943 billion. So 2,943,355,459. So I'm going to put that here in our shares outstanding. And so this is what each share is worth, right? So if you think about it, there's 2 billion shares of the company, or 2.9 billion, so pretty close to 3 billion shares. Each share is $133. So if you were to try to buy every share and you could buy them for that price, it would cost you almost $400 billion. So that is the worth of the company JP Morgan. That is what's called their market capitalization, or sometimes just market cap for short. So the market cap of JP Morgan is $400 billion, and it's the biggest bank in the world as far as I know. So I'm going to just mark down here, this is my kind of method. That's hopefully will become a standard on Wall Street. I know a lot of people watch these videos, so this is what I like to put down, the 6 basic elements of any company. So a $393 billion company, each share is $133. So if you bought 1 million shares of JP Morgan, right, it would cost you $133 million, right? That's a lot of money. And you still would not be a big shareholder of JP Morgan. You would not even own 1% of the company, right? 1% of JP Morgan would cost you $3 or $4 billion, just about $4 billion, which is more money than most people have, more money than Mark Cuban has, or Jason Calacanis, or anybody like that. I'm just joking around on those guys. But in all seriousness, it's a lot of money. And if you owned 1% of JP Morgan, guess how much power you would have over Jamie Dimon or someone like that, the CEO of JP Morgan? Absolutely zero. You would have no power over them. You could not tell them anything. They have every right to say, oh, you own 1% of our company? Kiss our butt. We don't care. If you own 5% of JP Morgan, you might have a say, but that would cost you $20 billion. The amount of people who have $20 billion is very limited. And even then, you might not have much of a say. So this is a really big company, and it's going to be very, very hard to push them around. They're also a very regulated company. The key regulator that you should know about is not the FDIC. It's actually called the OCC. And many people have never heard of the OCC. The OCC is the Office of the Controller of the Currency. And this is one of the most important government entities, and almost nobody knows what this is. This is the bank regulator. The FDIC is just the insurance company. This is the company that is supposed to regulate all the banks. So I haven't heard many people talking about the OCC. But let me see here. It says here, the OCC examines the condition of the banks it supervises and their compliance with laws and regulations. Let's see, who is the OCC chairperson? Michael J. Sue. Yes. I remember when he was confirmed. I think there was a lot of speeches this person made over diversity and inclusion, which I'm for diversity and inclusion, but I'm also more in favor of looking at bank balance sheets very closely. So in any event, let's keep going with this 10K. Nothing wrong with diversity and inclusion. So one of the things about JP Morgan that a lot of people don't know is that JP Morgan was not always a really big bank. And one of the things that is interesting to understand is that JP Morgan became a very big bank in the last 20 years. There was a bank called Manufacturers Hanover, and the merger of Manufacturers Hanover, it's now defunct, but Chemical Bank and JP Morgan created this monstrosity. So banks were actually quite a bit more diversified over the years. But this successor to, or JP Morgan is kind of the successor of this bank, but Manufacturers Hanover Trust was sort of like the big mergers that occurred to create JP Morgan. If you really want to learn a lot about banking, I think Balaji tweeted out a chart of all the mergers that created JP Morgan. So JP Morgan also has roots with Morgan Stanley. They're very different companies, but they both started out a long time ago. So the history of banking is actually quite interesting, but let's get to the gist of this. And in fact, I can probably just skip to the financial statements by clicking right here. Jamie Dimon, the famous CEO of JP Morgan, is 66. I'm personally not a fan of JP Morgan, the company, but in terms of like customer service and stuff like that. But remember, it's an investment bank, and it does a lot more than just do commercial banking and retail banking. So let's see if we can find the financials. I see MD&A, so let me go back because I think maybe I missed it. Let's see, financial statements and supplementary data. There might be like this separate, there's often this like separate section. So I'm a little frustrated because this is a very, very big document, and I just want to make sure that I get the right, okay, here's usually where it is. Okay, cool, here it is. So the auditor's Pricewaterhouse, and here's their income statement. We looked at the pharma company's income statement a minute ago, but now we're going to look at JP Morgan's balance sheet first. But you can see they have an income statement too. There's revenue, right? There's costs, and there's income. And a lot of the revenue you can see is coming from interest, right? The interest on the loans that they make. They make loans with your money. They don't give you their profits, right? Look at how much money they made, $35 billion. You don't get those profits. They get those profits. Their shareholders get those profits. They get bonuses from those profits. You get nothing. You get the lowest possible interest rate that they can possibly provide to get you to give them their money. to give them your money, which they will hold and risk and lend and do whatever they want with, and give you it back if they can hold on to it, which Silicon Valley could not hold on to it. So let's look at the balance sheet in terms of cash and due from banks. Again, there's so many squirrely things in these bank balance sheets that make you go, cash is something that I think anybody can understand what cash is. But when it comes to a bank, it's not that simple. It says due from banks. What does that mean, due from banks? So this is money that JP Morgan has, but it's also money that other banks owe them, I guess. And this is $27 billion. And what's interesting is that that's not a lot of money for JP Morgan. You can see that just the next item is $500 billion, and that's deposits with banks. But wait a second, aren't they a bank? Why are they deposits with banks? It's kind of a funny statement, so we're going to have to look at that too and say, well, where are those deposits actually deposited? Or I'd assume they're with JP Morgan itself, but it's just sort of a funny name, isn't it? So we just looked at the first two parts of the balance sheet, and I've been looking at financial statements for 20 years. I'm something of an authority on the matter, and bank balance sheets are not simple. So here's the next one. Federal funds sold and securities purchased under resale agreements. Help me understand what that is. Does that sound like English to you? $315 billion. So $315 billion of federal funds sold and securities purchased under resale agreements. Not as easy as pharma or tech. If you look at Cisco's balance sheet or Microsoft's balance sheet, the most complicated thing you're going to see is deferred revenue. This is not so simple. All right, securities borrowed. That is $185 billion. Trading assets. And the other thing here about securities borrowed is look at the fair value versus the actual book value, right? And this is something that Bill Ackman was talking about the other day, that those are two very different things, but let's keep going. Trading assets, $453 billion. Available for sale securities, $205 billion. So this is sort of the most understandable thing. These are basically just securities, right? These are just financial instruments that JP Morgan owns. So I think I can understand that. And this is held to maturity securities. So these are basically bonds, right? Held to maturity securities. So I'm actually going to combine these two, available for sale and held to maturity. And you can basically see that they have 600 billion-ish of securities that they could sell that seem like cash. So between this, and this, they kind of that kind of looks and feels very cash-like. These three, I don't know. They could be cash-like, but I have no clue. But this is $1 trillion of cash that seems to, or cash-like things that seem to belong to them. All right, so now they have loans, and these loans are the biggest part of their balance sheet. They have $1 trillion of loans. But if you look at the investment securities, net of allowances for credit losses, they have this number 600 billion. So I think that's a separate line. Pretty sure it is. Okay. I want to make sure I did all this right, because it looks like there was 425, 205, and then 631, 162. Okay, so we're actually they added them as well. So I added them, they added them. That's a good sign. So now there's the bulk of the bank, which is loans, right? Loans, and we have loan losses. So I'm just going to do net loans. So this is also quite understandable to me. That's an asset. And so in terms of the assets I understand, and I'm being humble here, that I think these are things you and I can both understand, that we're looking at $2 trillion that we understand. This is their cash as well. These are stocks and bonds that they own, mostly bonds, and these are loans that they've made. So almost 2.3 trillion we understand, and maybe 1 trillion is not quite obvious until we do a little more thinking and research. And again, I'm not a bank analyst, so this isn't my forte, but I do know financial statements. So the rest is pretty small, actually. So we have accrued interest. We actually do have property, plant, and equipment, and we actually do have goodwill. And then we have other. So the total assets of JP Morgan is going to be the combination of all this. The accrued interest is pretty small on at least a relative basis. It's 125 billion. The premises and equipment is also small. These are all basically the buildings and servers of JP Morgan, and that's 27 or 28 billion. The goodwill is not insubstantial at 61 billion, and they have other assets. And the scary thing about other assets, right, is it's 182 billion, and you have no idea what it is. Hopefully they explain it somewhere in this massive document. And it could be one footnote in this whole document that blows everything up. And that's why you guys always ask me, like, Martin, man, you're always looking at these financial statements and it looks so tedious and you do it manually. Can't you write a computer program to do it? I write computer programs all day. You can go to my GitHub. I have a software company. Here's a little sample of a computer program I've been working on over the last few days. I am a computer programming, maybe not as good as some of my colleagues, but I'm a bit of an expert in that field. And trust me, when you do these financial statements, you want to do them very slowly and very, very carefully. You don't just want to, copy and paste and not double check the numbers yourself, because this is how things like SVB happen. It's people who do that and put their feet up and say, the computer did it. You have to be really engaged. If you are willing to take shortcuts and screw things up, then that's on you, but I'm not willing to do that. So anyway, those are the assets of JP Morgan, $3.6 billion. And like I said, every page, every letter of this entire document is relevant until proven otherwise. All right, deposits are a liability. That's something a lot of people don't understand. When you look at a bank, the deposit is a liability from the bank's perspective. Why? Because it's not their money, it's your money. And that's the problem, again, with the banking system, is they take your money, they make risky loans with it. When they make profit, they keep it. You don't get anything. They're going to give you a small percentage to keep that money. Should that change, I think we're going to start to see people think about that changing. I think we're going to start to see people talking about some other way of doing banking where it's more equitable. There are credit unions. There are other ways to do banking. You don't have to basically say, here, bank, go play with my money. Go gamble with my money. And if I need it back, maybe it'll be there, maybe it won't. I think that you're going to see more and more people say, wait a second, I see all these big buildings in Manhattan, half of them have JP Morgan as their biggest tenant. Why should I be paying all these brokers, traders, and executives bonuses with my deposit? And the truth is JP Morgan doesn't care about you. They could care less. They're going to pay you the smallest amount that they can pay, which right now I believe JP Morgan pays pretty much close to 0%. They pay almost 0% on checking accounts. And they lend out the money for quite a lot more, right? Their credit card loans, their mortgage loans, those are all very good interest payments. So if they get their money back, they keep all those profits. They don't share it with you. They don't say, well, listen, if I came to you tomorrow and I said, hey, I need to borrow $100,000. And you said, well, what are you going to do with it? Well, I have this great loan I'm going to make. I'm going to make this guy a loan and he's going to pay me 8% a year. And you say, okay, that sounds good, Martin. Are you going to share the 8% with me? Do you want to go 4% for you, 4% for me? And I told you, no, I want to go 99% me and maybe 1% you. And you said, what? That doesn't make any sense. And then you said, well, not only that, but Martin, I'm thinking about this. Maybe I'll do this because I trust you so much. But what happens if that guy doesn't pay the loan? What happens to me? I said, well, you're screwed. And what happens to you? Well, just nothing happens to me. So you want me to take all of the risk, but have zero of the benefit. Why would you do that? And I think that banks are probably going to take a backseat to other shadow banks like hedge funds and other things. So I think that the banking system could change at some point, but I think that banks have become this like necessary evil, and because they're necessary, we can't help but bank somewhere. And there's this oligopoly of banks that sort of the government's created, whether it's JP Morgan or Bank of America or Wells Fargo. There's a handful of big banks that you kind of have to go to, especially if you're a big company. The average person can't change a bank. But if Apple moved their money from JP Morgan to Silicon Valley would be solvent. But Apple can't do that. It's too risky. So it's a really messed up system. It'd be nice if there was another solution. I know people have talked about crypto. Crypto is not really robust enough to account for the entire financial system. Bitcoin barely works, to be frank. There could be another system that develops over time. I sure hope so. But I would love to see, there be some solution that works. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that JP Morgan, at the same token, does help the world go round. If you're a big bank like JP Morgan, you are lending money to big corporations like Apple and Pfizer and Merck. And those companies are doing good things. So you need a bank like that who can help you do a $20 billion financing. Silicon Valley Bank isn't worth $20 billion themselves, let alone could they lend you $20 billion. So it's pretty tricky to sort of live or see a world without banks because big corporate activities would cease to exist. There has to be some counterparty that can make a huge loan. Now, at the same token, some of the big non-bank financial institutions like like Berkshire Hathaway. Berkshire Hathaway can make you a private loan. I've actually gone to hedge funds for private loans sometimes. They're much more expensive, but you can go to BlackRock for a private loan. And these are sometimes called shadow banks for this reason. They're not banks, but hey, they can make you a loan. Anybody can make you a loan. It's just a matter of who's doing it and where is their money coming from. So I do think that we're going to see an increase, quite frankly, of shadow banking due to some of the changes that are happening. So anyway, JP Morgan has 2.3 trillion in deposits and 3.7 in assets. So they're covered now, but they have other liabilities. Let's look at their other liabilities. They have this federal funds purchased liability. What's nice about this is that if you look at the difference between the federal funds sold and the federal funds purchased, they kind of net out a little bit. So we still want to understand what that is. And forgive me for not knowing exactly how every piece of the Federal Reserve banking system works in America. It's fairly complicated. I know a little bit about it, but we want to look at some detailed footnotes. There's nothing wrong with saying you're not 100% sure of something and going and checking it out. So here they have some debt, and this is just debt that this is their paper basically, right? These are the bonds that they've sold to Wall Street to finance their business. And it almost makes you wonder why a bank needs to have debt. Isn't that funny? That a bank like JP Morgan actually has debt. I can understand an industrial company having debt, right? If I'm Pfizer and I want to buy a biotech company that's really promising, I might say, well, I could pay with it with cash on my balance sheet, or I can borrow money from JP Morgan. That kind of makes sense. But it's kind of weird to me that then JP Morgan would go borrow money as well. And it's not a small amount, right? It's $350 billion. And presumably it's a safe bet, but what do we know, right? Everything's safe until proven otherwise. But it does make you wonder. So here's trading liabilities. And again, I think these are as I think more about what could trading liabilities be. They have trading assets and trading liabilities. I think these are probably assets with trading partners, things like that. So it's about 200 billion. Accounts payable, so this is money they owe, and other liabilities. It's a very large number for a pretty vague statement. So these bank balance sheets are something else, I gotta tell you. And maybe we'll look at a small regional bank as well, like First Republic. All right, so we have VIEs, which are sort of weird sort of financial instruments. And that's it. We have total liabilities of 3.3 billion. So the book value of JP Morgan is 292 billion. And if we reduce that by goodwill, the tangible book value, right? The tangible book value is 231 billion. But the market value of JP Morgan is 393 billion. So it makes you wonder why JP Morgan's trading at 2 times book value. Most people say that banks should trade at 1 times book value, or slight premium to that, but not more. So JP Morgan looks pretty overvalued just based on that alone. But we still also have to dissect this really carefully. But that's a rule of thumb for most banks, is that they should not be trading at this massive premium to their book value, because ultimately, a bank is nothing more than its assets. And as its assets get worked out, that's really all you get in the bank. It's not like you're buying a franchise, right? You're just buying the current loan book. So that doesn't apply in a tech company where the book value doesn't really tell you anything other than maybe the rock bottom value of what a company should be. Whereas book value for a bank actually does kind of reflect, what it should be. So do we want to look at First Republic really quickly?